episode 88 of the Real World Wellness Podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Christine Lehman, a certified nutritional therapy practitioner and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. You can use my contact form on my website to request a free 15-minute consultation with me. I also see people with a variety of autoimmune disorders, help people lose weight, as well as reverse type 2 diabetes and help people prevent diabetes. Please remember while you're listening to the program, advice and information we provide is intended to be helpful and informative, but is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment. So today I'm going to talk about dark chocolate again, and this is part 2 of a 2-part series. Part 1 in episode 87 discussed the history of the cacao plant, where it's grown, and some of the many health benefits. So today we're going to talk more about how the cacao beans are processed and what to look for in buying high quality chocolate. So I touched a little bit about the harvesting process of the cacao beans, which are separated and removed from the pulpy part of the plant. I love that, pulpy. But today I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the process, and we're really limiting the scope here to artisanal chocolate. And artisanal is kind of the way it sounds. If you think of artisans, it's basically making things by hand. So I like the term artisanal chocolate. And along those lines, another term that is being used is minimally processed. And the companies that I researched that produce minimally processed artisanal dark chocolate are Madakas, Taza, and Scharfenberger. Now, I admit my research has been somewhat limited to Google and reviewing websites of about 5 or 6 chocolate makers. So it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some of the higher quality artisanal chocolate makers who source locally and try to engage in sustainable practices. And I will talk about that more in detail soon. One of the things that's a little bit of a red flag for me is if I don't see the country or countries of origin listed, then I don't know where they're sourcing their beans from. So that is certainly one thing among others that I want to know when I'm doing my research. So all these sites certainly that I just mentioned definitely list the sources of their cacao beans. So, as you recall from my last talk, cacao plants grow best near the equator, and so Scharfenberger, which I just mentioned is a pretty high quality chocolate maker and produces artisanal chocolate, says they, and I'm quoting their website, says they traveled the world in search of the finest cacao beans, carefully selecting and blending beans from fabled cacao-producing countries, including Madagascar, Indonesia, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Trinidad, Tanzania, Venezuela, Brazil, Panama, Vietnam, Grenada, Papua New Guinea, Bali, Ghana, and Peru. So that list extends basically from South America to the Caribbean to Indonesia is in Southeast Asia. And Madagascar is off the coast of Africa. So quite a list there. But what they all have in common is that they're near the equator. And that is important also for environmental reasons when you think about the rainforests, and which we'll talk about the environmental impact shortly. What I also found interesting from their website is the descriptions of artisanal chocolate can sound similar to descriptions used for different wines, like with characteristics such as chocolate, fruit, spice, floral, tobacco, leather, woody, earthy. So people are approaching chocolate, or these artisanal chocolate and of course dark chocolate, with similar ideas along the varietals of wine, and we talked a little bit about 3 of the main types of chocolate. And so they use terms again like fruity notes and so on. So it isn't, in complexity and balance. So it really is becoming kind of an art form in terms of the descriptions of chocolate these days. And again, this is very fine cacao, not the Hershey's chocolate. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the fermentation process because that is essential to developing cacao's chocolate flavor when the beans are roasted, along with those fruity notes that characterize fine cacao. And Taza, Madagascar, and Schaffenberger all use this process, which involves, so the fermentation specifically involves placing wet cacao beans in heaps or boxes covered with banana leaves or burlap. During the first 36 to 48 hours, the process is anaerobic as opposed to aerobic, which helps grow the yeast that convert sugars to ethanol and break down the cell structure of the pulp. So after about 48 hours, the cacao is aerated, which is pretty much the way it sounds. It's been exposed to air. It promotes the growth of lactic acid bacteria that convert the ethanol and remaining sugar to acetic and lactic acid, which is pretty sciencey here. After fermentation, the beans are spread in the sun and slowly dried to achieve optimum flavor development. Sunlight also helps to break down some of the acidity left in the beans after fermentation. So it's a very natural process, which is important here, and organic in the true sense of the word, because you're not using any pesticides, and you're certainly just allowing nature to do what it does. So after fermentation, the roasting is the single most important step. That is began by cleaning the beans, then pasteurizing them using a combination of steam and pressure. And again, I'm referring to the Scharfenberger website for this information. The beans are then placed in the roaster and slowly brought up to the desired temperature. Now each origin, I know when they say that, and you may see this on packaging where it'll say something like single origin, that means a single country. So that's what that term means. Each origin has its own specific roasting parameters, but since those times can vary, each batch of beans must be carefully monitored to ensure it's roasted correctly. So and then, of course, the goal is to develop a fine chocolate flavor. Next steps are grinding and refining. Now, this process can really vary depending on how locally processed the chocolate is. Again, it goes back to this concept of minimally processed, which is, I think, a criteria that you want. So all these three companies pretty much do as much of the process they can locally in that minimally processed way. So with Scharfenberger, after roasting, the beans are cooled, the shells are removed, and the resulting edible nibs are transferred to a granite roller called a mélangeur or jur, depending if it's French pronunciation, where they are slowly ground into a paste called chocolate liqueur. The chocolate liqueur is then transferred to a refiner conch along with crystal cane sugar and whole bourbon vanilla beans, which is mixed for about 25 hours. It is then transferred to a storage tank to await molding into bars. Now, Taza, T-A-Z-A chocolate, uses traditional Mexican stone mills called molinos to grind their cacao. The hand-carved stones that turn inside these mills preserve the bright, fruity flavors of the beans. Now, a century ago, most of the world's chocolate was made this way, and what's unique is that this tradition has been preserved by these companies. However, today's factories, probably would think something like a huge conglomerate called Hershey's Chocolate most likely is doing this. They use pin mills to rip the nibs apart at high speeds and temperatures. This violent process, while suitable for bulk cacao, destroys the nuanced flavor of the fine beans. So if I was looking around at chocolate companies and I was tempted to go more the cheaper bulk cacao route, you might want to just find out how they grind their beans and whether they use one of those pin mills or did they do it more the old-fashioned way. And the other rationale is that these artisanal chocolate makers go to a lot of trouble to source and grow their beans locally. They go through this whole cultivation and fermentation process, so they really don't want that to be destroyed, the nuanced flavors of the beans, by a harsh grinding and refining process. Now, there is another step called temper and finish. So prior to molding into the bars, the refined chocolate must first be tempered. The cacao butter in chocolate is a unique fat that can exist in 6 different crystal forms, of which only 2 are reasonably stable. So just keep in mind that butter is sort of a semi-solid, and depending on the heat that's used, you could turn it into liquid, or you can turn it into a stable fat. So tempering is a process that lowers and then raises the chocolate temperature while mixing to assure the formation of stable crystals. This solidifies the chocolate, gives it a good gloss and snap, and helps it stay that way during storage. So now that I've given you an idea of the artisanal process, again, which is used in high quality, quote unquote, chocolate, I want to talk about what to look for when buying this artisanal dark chocolate. And I'm focusing on dark chocolate for the health benefits that I discussed last time. So I'm going to give you kind of a primer to help you understand what some common terms are that are used by chocolate makers, and what I would look for. So the first one is this phrase, bean to bar. What does that mean? It means that the chocolate is produced entirely by the chocolate company from the harvesting, which is the initial step of harvesting the cacao beans, to packaging, usually a bar or something, pieces of chocolate. However, not surprisingly, some large-scale chocolate companies buy probably wholesale discs or blocks of chocolate that are then melted into bars. So that is not a bean to bar process. Now, another question that I think is important to consider is how much the percentage of cacao is, and which is usually listed, not always. I like it to be listed. I like to know how much cacao is in the bar. And the reason this makes a difference is you want to know if you're going to get all the health benefits of dark chocolate, and also the higher the cacao, the lower the sugar. So, but first, what does that percentage mean? Well, the percentage represents the weight of all the ingredients derived from cocoa within a bar, including the cocoa liquor and the cocoa solids and the cocoa butter. So the cocoa solids are pretty much the way it sounds. That's the the solid part of the cacao. The cacao butter is also has some health benefits, which I'll remind you about in a second. And the cocoa liquor is part of the process of grinding it into the paste. So, in my opinion, I look for at least 70, could be 75% of cacao for that reason. I want all these ingredients in as high as percentage as possible. Now you can go, I said a minimum, so you can go certainly up to 90%. But it does become a question of taste. For some people that is just too concentrated, and that's not enough sugar for them. So a balance might be, I would say, start at 70%, see how you like it, and then you can always move it up. So I bought a 70% dark cacao bar from Madagascar, and it's like made cast, so MADECASSE, and they source their cacao beans from Madagascar, again off an island off the coast of Africa. So now it wasn't, when obviously high quality dark chocolate sourced from locally meaning globally, not in your backyard, is bound to cost a little bit more than this bulk and more inexpensive chocolate like a Hershey's. So if that's your mindset, then frankly, this may not be for you. But if you want to pay a little bit more for a very high quality chocolate, I would recommend these companies like Taza and Maracas. Now, each bar was about $4.50 each, but each one weighed 75 grams. So that's a fairly significant size bar. And the quality is so high that I found that just a little square lasts me for at least a day. And I'm talking a little bit. So it goes a long way. So keep that in mind. So one of the reasons you want the higher cacao is because it does mean less sugar. And so here's an example. As I said, this bar weighing 75 grams, each serving size is half a bar or 38 grams. So the amount of sugar per serving is 11 grams. So that translates to about 29% per serving of sugar. So that's when it says 70% cacao, then typically the sugar will be about the remaining amount, so approximately 30%. So when it's 80% cacao, you're going to have about 20% sugar. So as I said, the higher the cacao, the lower the sugar content. Also, to know what's in your chocolate bar, you want to read the ingredients. So for example, when I read the ingredients listed on the back of my Maracas 70% dark chocolate bar, cacao batter was listed. That also tells me that that's included in that 70% cacao. But as I mentioned in part 1, cacao butter is important because it contains stearic acid, which has antiviral, antimicrobial, and antibacterial properties. So I also noticed that the Maracas packaging states that the bar is gluten-free, vegan, no GMO, and kosher. Because the ingredients are cacao beans, cacao butter, sugar, and sunflower lecithin, which by the way is an emulsifier. So that stabilizes and makes the bar smooth. These claims are not surprising, but the label also says that the bar may contain traces of milk and traces of nuts, and that relates to the manufacturing process. So while it's probably great for you lifestyle vegans, you may want to avoid eating this if you have any nut or dairy allergies. Taza, which produces this stone ground chocolate and got its roots in Mexico and Oaxaca, actually, where I visited, and I was able to taste some of this stone ground chocolate in Oaxaca City and fell in love with it. They go a step further, and they're independently certified as gluten-free, verified GMO-free, as well as soy, dairy-free, and vegan. So if you really have any concerns about the dairy, or you may want to go with Taza. So one of the other items that I thought was important to talk about, again going back to terminology here, is I came across this phrase, direct trade. I think most of us are familiar with fair trade, which what they share in common is they negotiate with local farmers. Again, they're sourcing in other countries for their cacao beans, usually near the equator, and it's a fixed price, so it doesn't subject the farmers to price fluctuations like based on the market price. So that gives them some sense of security, which is good, right? But interestingly, direct trade, according to what I was reading on their websites, goes above and beyond fair trade prices. So the way Madagascar describes their direct trade philosophy is they work directly with local cacao farmers in Madagascar. So Madagascar and Madagascar are synonymous here, and they have relationships with them. And they say direct trade is a way of doing business. It's used by smaller companies that have an integrated supply chain and work directly with farmers on the ground. It's a bottoms-up approach to improving farmer income and bridging the gap between grower, produce, and you. They say we go way beyond fair trade. We know the farmers we work with on a daily basis, and they know us, and we share meals in their homes, and we share a vision for prosperity. And they produce a transparency report. Taza also engages in direct trade practices, and they even have a Taza chocolate direct trade certified cacao. So there is a certifying body for this. And so they say they're chocolate pioneers, and they describe direct trade as no predatory middlemen and abusive labor practices. They engaged or created the chocolate industry's first third-party certified direct trade cacao sourcing program to ensure quality and transparency for all. So that's kudos to Taza for doing that. We have real face-to-face relationships with growers who respect the environment and fair labor practices. They provide us with the best organic cacao, and we pay them prices significantly higher than fair trade. And they also provide annual cacao sourcing transparency reports. So you can get both those transparency reports, annual reports from Taza, as well as Maracas on their websites. So the other thing about Taza is they do have the USDA organic certification. And why is that important? Well, whether the USDA standards are pretty high, but certainly any organic certification is going to meet the minimal standards of being GMO-free and free of synthetic pesticides. The USDA goes beyond that and also ensures certain environmental practices. So the USDA certification is probably a bit higher standard, but not every chocolate maker has that. Taza, I think, is unique in having that across the board for all their chocolate products. And again, it's better for humans, it's better for the animals, better for environment, if animals are involved. But I mean, they are obviously if they're grazing. So Maracas has 2 bars that are certified, USDA certified organic. They're Mint Crunch, and they're 92% dark. So I stand corrected. They actually have a 92% dark chocolate bar. So that's 92% cacao, obviously. They say here the rest of our bars are made using certified organic cacao, but we do not have that on the label. Well, some other chocolate makers like Cacao Prieto, which is Preto, based in Brooklyn, New York, they source their beans from an organic family farm in the Dominican Republic, and their packaging states that their chocolate is 100% organic. However, I didn't see a third-party certification on the packaging. They may have it, but I didn't see it. An interesting fact about the Dominican Republic is that, and this statistic comes from Liston Diario in 2006. So he writes that while 1.4%, which is very small, of the world's cacao comes from the Dominican Republic, that amount represents more than 70% of the organic cacao market. So that's quite a significant amount of organic cacao coming from the Dominican Republic. So although direct trade certification is probably better than fair trade, that is, as I mentioned earlier, still better than free market prices, which fluctuate a lot. So I found this really cool case study on the impact of a district in Belize that was growing cacao and then switched over to organic. And they were able, through an organic certification with a British company, to have many agricultural, environmental, economic, and social benefits that outweigh the alternatives to certification, which would have been using pesticides. So I'm just going to run through this. I just thought this was really interesting. The Maya Indians have been growing cacao in southern Belize since their ancestors first discovered the benefits of cacao. And if you remembered, it was in Belize, well, let me start there. It was in between Guatemala and Mexico, so it's really more in Central America. The Toledo district of Belize has been involved with the USDA project in the 1980s, and this is sort of a lesson in what not to do, in which the large corporation Hershey's was set to be the original buyer of cacao produced in the area. However, that was based on the free market prices, and so the time I guess the contract went through, the prices of cacao were $1.75 per pound, and then they dropped to only 55 cents per pound. So basically this whole thing fell apart. Many Maya cacao farmers abandoned their plots due to the failing price of cacao. However, things turned around when this district, Toledo district, in 1993, negotiated a contract with this London-based company called Green and Black's Organic Chocolate, who needed a new organic cacao supplier. So they had their own pre-existing Toledo Cacao Growers Association, and they were able to get their organic certification, fair trade certifications awarded in 1994. And that, again, allows the farmers to have a guaranteed market for their cacao, which they can sell for a guaranteed fixed price. So anyway, the environmental impact was really positive. So the cacao, again, you want cacao grown in shade tree conditions without the use of fertilizers and pesticides. It is widely acknowledged that cacao grown in shade tree farms harbors higher biodiversity than other tropical crops. The trees provide homes for domestic and migratory species of birds and act as a habitat for a variety of animals. The ground remains undisturbed when there is no clearing for planting, and thus there is minimal soil erosion and trees remain intact. The economic impact in this Toledo district in Belize has been tremendous. It is often difficult to find employment, and many Maya in the area rely on subsistence farming to provide for their families. This organic chocolate company, Green and Black's, was paying to the Toledo Growers Association about 78 cents per pound for dried and fermented cacao. This price was significantly more than the average world market price for cacao at the time. Green and Black's also pays for the organic certification to the Toledo Council Growers Association annually, and the Fair Trade Foundation also pays for that certification. But I think what impressed me most was that the social impact. The people living within the Toledo district have had in the past less access to education and health services. With the contract between the TCGA, which is their Growers Association, and Green and Black, farmers have been able to raise money to afford to send their children to school. The money earned from cacao production has led to another benefit. Many farmers no longer make the commute to citrus fields up north to earn more income because they're making enough through cacao farming, thus allowing children in the family the opportunity to attend school because they're not maintaining the farm at home when their fathers go off to the citrus fields. Another interesting benefit was that the women have seen a change because they're more involved in the organic fair trade cacao. They joined the managing council of this Growers Association, and they've also become landowners and registering with the TCGA for organic certification. There's greater equality of women in the area, which has empowered them because now they're generating income for their own and providing for their families, which allows them to make sound decisions. The Toledo Council Growers Association has recognized that women are becoming an integral part of the process, from working in the cacao plant nurseries to grafting and managing fields alongside men to harvesting cacao to taking care of the fermenting and drying processes. So this in turn has led the TCGA to increase resources for women. These new social advantages would never have been possible without the organic contract with Green and Black's. So if you're socially, environmentally, and health conscious and you want great tasting, high quality chocolate, I strongly urge you to consider buying from small artisanal chocolate companies like Tasa and Madagascar, and I will include their websites in the show notes. Next episode, I'm going to be talking about different aspects of thyroid health and what happens when your thyroid is removed. Thanks for listening and have a great, healthy week.